The football war. I mean, the name itself sounds, well, it sounds almost unbelievable, doesn't it? A war started by a soccer game? But today, we're going to peel back that simple label and get to the heart of what really happened. So I want you to picture this. It's June of 1969. The whole world is buzzing about the moon landing. But in Central America, two nations, El Salvador and Honduras, are locked in this superheated three-game series to qualify for the World Cup. Fast forward just a few weeks, and the Salvadoran army is invading Honduras. It's just a shocking escalation. And that really brings us to the biggest question of this whole story. Is it even possible for a simple game? I mean, yeah, soccer's passionate, but still, to actually kick off a full-blown war? Well, as you might have guessed, the answer is way more complicated than that.
To really get what happened, we have to look way past the soccer pitch. You have to look at the decades of tension that were simmering just below the surface. The real causes were deep-rooted problems, with land, with a huge population imbalance and migration. The soccer games, they weren't the cause. They were just the match thrown onto a powder keg that was already waiting to explode.
Now, check out these numbers, because this is where things get really clear. Honduras is more than 5 times bigger than El Salvador. But back in 1969, El Salvador had almost 1 million more people. It was the most densely populated country in the entire region. And all that pressure, it had to go somewhere.
And that pressure was building inside the country, too. In El Salvador, the way land was divided up was just incredibly unfair. You had this tiny elite, just 5% of the farms, controlling a massive 70% of the land. So for hundreds of thousands of regular people, there was just no opportunity. No land, no future. So where did they go? They looked right next door, to Honduras. By 1969, more than 300,000 Salvadorans had moved there. Many of them just settled on unused land and started to build a life for themselves. I mean, 300,000 people, they made up over 10% of the entire Honduran population at the time. And this is where the situation really turned critical. In the 60s, Honduras passed a new land reform law. Now, the idea was to give land to native-born Hondurans, but the way they did it was by taking the land that those Salvadoran immigrants had been farming for years. All of a sudden, those 300,000 people were facing being kicked out and losing everything they had built. So you have all this tension just boiling over about land, about deportations, and right at that moment, the two nations get pitted against each other in the World Cup qualifiers. It was literally the worst possible timing. It just turned all that national pride into a vehicle for national anger. The games themselves became these violent flashpoints. The first match is in Honduras. The Salvadoran team gets harassed all night. Honduras wins a close one. So for the second match, in El Salvador, it's payback time. There are riots in the streets. El Salvador wins easily. The final deciding playoff had to be held in neutral Mexico City. And just hours before El Salvador won that game, diplomacy between the two countries completely fell apart.
And this right here, this is the moment everything changed. On the very same day as that final match, El Salvador officially cuts all ties with Honduras. And just listen to the language they used: genocide. They claimed Honduras was committing genocide by violently forcing Salvadorans out of the country. The rhetoric had gone from a sports rivalry to an accusation of mass murder.
So with diplomacy dead and nationalism at a total fever pitch, it took less than 3 weeks for everything to just explode into open war. The fighting itself would be incredibly short. That's why it's also called the 100-hour war, but its impact, that would be anything but short.
On July 14th, the Salvadoran military launched a surprise attack. You can see on this map how they pushed forward on 2 fronts. One group moved along the main Pan-American highway, while the other targeted key economic areas. And their initial advance, it was fast.
The whole war basically unfolded over 4 chaotic days. El Salvador launches their surprise attack, but then the Honduran Air Force hits back, and they hit back hard. They bombed crucial fuel depots, which pretty much crippled El Salvador's supply lines. The Salvadoran army did manage to capture a key town, but their offensive stalled out. And that's when the Organization of American States scrambled to get a ceasefire in place on July 18th.
And get this, both sides were fighting with old World War II-era equipment. The Honduran Air Force, for example, was heavily relying on these planes, the classic F-4U Corsair. And this leads to a really fascinating little footnote in military history. Believe it or not, this conflict was the very last time in history that propeller-driven piston-engine fighters, like the American P-51 Mustang and the F-4U Corsair, actually fought each other in the sky. It was the end of an era in aerial combat, and it happened right here, in this small regional war. So Even though the fighting only lasted for 100 hours, the consequences were absolutely devastating. They rippled through Central America for decades. And this is where we see the true cost of the conflict, far, far away from the battlefield. The human cost is actually pretty hard to pin down. The official numbers from both sides were low, but as you can see, estimates from other sources, like the CIA, suggest the total death toll, including civilians, was probably well over 1,000 people. A horrific price for just 4 days of fighting. And the long-term fallout was just catastrophic. Trade between the two countries completely collapsed, and that crippled the regional economy. Tens of thousands of Salvadoran refugees flooded back into a country that just couldn't support them, creating massive social unrest. And this is so crucial. Many historians argue that this instability was a major trigger for the brutal Salvadoran Civil War that erupted just a decade later.
Now here's a wild piece of context. You might wonder why this war didn't get more international attention. Well, it's because just 2 days after it started, Apollo 11 launched. And on July 20th, while Salvadoran troops were still on Honduran soil, the entire world was glued to their TVs watching Neil Armstrong walk on the moon.
And just look at how long it took to formally end things. A peace treaty wasn't signed until 1980. That's 11 years later. And the final border disputes weren't even settled by an international court until 1992. It took 23 years to fully resolve an 100-hour war.
And of course, propaganda was key. You see documents like this one, a declaration from the Salvadoran president, and it shows how both governments use this intense nationalism to rally their people and justify the conflict.
So in the end, the war's legacy wasn't just about broken treaties or old airplanes. It was etched into the landscape and into the lives of the people. A whole generation of displaced families whose struggles would define the region for decades to come. But, there is a hopeful end to this story, at least for the players. Decades later, the very same men from those infamous 1969 matches, they all got back together. They played friendly games to raise money for earthquake relief in El Salvador. It just goes to show you that the animosity was really a product of politics, not the players themselves. So yeah, the football war is a catchy name, but it's really a misnomer. It hides this much more complex story of inequality, migration, and nationalism, and it leaves us with a really important question to think about. The next time you hear a simple, dramatic name for a historical event, what deeper, more complicated truths might that name actually be hiding?